Hello and welcome to Soberanía, the Mexican Politics Podcast. I'm your co-host, Jose Luis Granados Ceja, coming to you from Mexico City. I'm a Mexican-born journalist and writer working for Venezuela Analysis, the Mexico Solidarity Project, and soon in Al Jazeera. And I'm joined, as always, with Kurt Hackbarth, co-host of the podcast. How are you doing, Kurt?
Doing very well. Kurt Hackbarth from Jacobin Magazine and Sentido Común, reporting from Oaxaca, La Verde Antequera.
And so today we're going to be presenting you with a bit of an update in terms of how's the election going. For those of you who listen to us on Apple Podcasts or on Spotify Podcast, we actually did a special program right after the launch of the campaign on March 1st, a couple Fridays ago, where Claudia Sheinbaum filled the Zócalo completely. Estimates say about 350,000 to 400,000 people turned out to her opening demo. And right afterwards, Kurt and I got together and we did a quick little review response. We were joined by Camila Escalante from Gaucecho News, who gave us her analysis of a regional perspective as well. So for those of you who listen to us via Apple Podcasts and Spotify, that's on YouTube. Check it out. That's initial impressions of the actual campaign launch, which we won't get into today. What we're here to talk about today is where are things at in the election. This is now started in earnest. We will be in campaign season here in Mexico, basically up until the end of May. The campaign period closes just shortly before Election Day, which is on June 2nd of this year, where we will determine the government of Mexico for the next 6 years, as well as also several governorships. But of course, critically, which we'll also be talking about today, the Jefatura de Gobierno. I always say people translate it as the mayor of Mexico City. I don't think that quite transmits the level of responsibility that one has as the head of government in Mexico City. I think it's more akin to a governor. It's such a big city to begin with, the metropolitan area. But I want to begin with that. What are your initial thoughts, impressions about how the election campaign is playing out thus far? We're at the very beginning, but are some of the things that we are anticipating starting to come through?
Yeah, Jose Luis. I think we can maybe put the polls up on the screen and we can see where we're at. What we see is a real stability, right? I mean, this is the way the polling has looked for months, stretching back to last year, both on the national level and many of the other races. So what you see here is Claudia Sheinbaum with a really large lead across polling companies. So if you look here on the screen, those of you who are listening will narrate them. The El País Encol poll from Spain has Sheinbaum up by 30 points. The Heraldo poll has Sheinbaum at 55%, 58% by Finance and CNE. And then we go down here, the TR Research, 62.4%. Gobernante has Sheinbaum at 55, and Arias Consultores has Sheinbaum at 53.4%. So this is across polling companies, and not all of them are from Mexico, right? So that's a big hill for Galvez to climb, especially because it doesn't look like she's climbing it at this point at all, right? The lead for Sheinbaum oscillates between 30 and in some cases closer to 35% in some of the polls, right? All this is subject to change, right? Polls are snapshots in a moment. Things could go down, things could go up. Races tend to tighten as a general rule in politics. That didn't happen in 2018, though. López Obrador started with the big lead that he maintained until the end. So this is just to give us an idea of the snapshot of the moment. And I think it's important to look at the polls for a very important reason. They're trying to already establish a narrative from the Mexican right wing and their allies in the U.S. press that this is going to be an election of state, right? Mm-hmm. That this is going to be an election where, López Obrador is basically imposing his hand-picked, the big word they like to use, hand-picked successor. If it were that, then he'd have to have all of these polling companies in their pocket, right? Including foreign polling companies. All of them agreeing, right, on the margin here, right? So that's the first thing to point out, that there's a stability in the race, and that every day that goes by, we're already getting up to midway into March, right? This is March 12th, we're recording this. It's only a 3-month campaign. 2 weeks are down. Polls aren't moving. What is Xochitl Galvez trying to do to turn that around? And I think that's going to be our next topic, right?
Before we move on, though, Kurt, poor Jorge Alvarez Mañez, you left him out completely.
Right. I forgot Jorge Alvarez, no?
Of course.
This
So
is
we have this third way, third rail kind of candidacy from Movimiento Ciudadano, which has largely occupied an opposition role in Mexican politics over the last 5.5 years. But in this case, it's trying to present itself as we say in Spanish, ni ellos ni aquellos, right? Neither
Right.
them nor the other guys. But it's not working for them. I think for those of you who are unfamiliar, Movimiento Ciudadano actually did back López Obrador's candidacy back in 2006 and in 2012, but went as part of the race in 2018 with the opposition, or sorry, the PAN, PRD and Movimiento Ciudadano. And then this one, they're running on their own. They don't have any electoral allies. And they originally wanted to run Samuel Garcia, a governor from the state of Nuevo León. But unfortunately, he decided to step down as a result of the politicking that was happening in his state that was making it very complicated for him to put in his handpicked successor as an interim governor there. And so they ended up going with Jorge Alvarez, who, you know, is a pretty visible person, all things considered, for Movimiento Ciudadano. He's a lawmaker in the lower house of Congress, but his candidacy just really isn't really getting much attention. This is very much a race between Morena and its allies and the opposition coalition PRI-PAN-PRD. So, as you said, I think
too,
for me...
Marcelo Ebrard was also flirting with running on Movimiento Ciudadano when he didn't get the Morena nomination.
And I think he's probably thanking himself and his advisors that he didn't, because he'd probably be facing similar numbers, to be honest. This is what the election race here is about. It's between continuity, more of a Morena-led government, or a revert to the neoliberal old regime, right? And like you said, I think for me the standout thing is, because a lot of people say, well, you can't trust polls, it's a flash in the pan, is the consistency. These numbers are consistent throughout the polling companies with a 25, 30-point lead, right? Like you said, 63 to 33. The closest race is 55 to 26, so it's still a very, very wide margin of advantage that Claudia has over Xochitl Galvez, and that hasn't really changed. You know, that's what we saw before the election period started. It's what we've seen now 2 weeks almost into the campaign. And so, like you said, what does that mean in terms of the strategy? And I think that's what we're starting to see. What is this campaign actually going to look like? What are they going to do to try to close that gap? And tell us, what do you think is the strategy of the opposition here?
So just with regards to brute numbers, you know, with about 10 weeks left in the campaign, Xochitl Galvez would have to make up 3 points a week now to catch up to Sheinbaum. 3 points a week, every week for 10 weeks. So her strategy is, and this has been part of the problem with Xochitl Galvez's campaign from the beginning, is she's trying to be everything to everyone, right? A chameleon type candidate who claims that she was once a young Trotskyist, right? This is true. She actually really claims this.
Yep.
But is now a member of the conservative coalition, right? And every day she comes out contradicting herself in order to try to, again, appeal to all comers, right? So as I have here on this tweet on the screen, she says she was, back when she was in the government of Felipe Calderon, right, 2006, 2012, she was in favor of building a refinery in Tula Hidalgo, which finally the Calderon government did not build, right? They just built a perimeter wall, famously, and left it there, failed to build the refinery, a huge waste of money. But now she wants to close 2 of Mexico's 6 refineries, one of them in Tampico, or the greater Tampico area, because it's really not in Tampico, it's another flub of hers, right? She's also said in the past, in true panista style, that the social programs should be temporary, right? Because they create dependence and people should be out working, right? In the words of the great and poetic spokesman of the PAN, Vicente Fox, get back to work, cabrones. No?
Quite literally.
Oh,
Quite literally
huevones, get
saying,
back to work, huevones. Get back to work, lazy
huevones,
asses.
yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
huevones.
Actually,
Sorry.
it's
Yeah.
interesting. Morena had a great spot where they featured some of these comments from Felipe Calderon saying like, oh, these ninis, as they call them, ni
Right.
estudian, ni trabajan,
You're
they don't
throwing
work.
money
They
at
don't
ninis. Yeah.
throwing money at ninis. We need to go back to work. There's no room in this country for you. And then they cut to Claudia giving a campaign speech saying, what we believe is in giving people access not to opportunities, but to their rights, to everything that the Constitution
That's an
and the
important,
international has.
That's a
Exactly.
very important distinction. Very
But of
important
course, we're in
distinction.
election period, so now they believe other things, right? As you say here in this tweet, if you don't like my principles, I have others.
The great Groucho Marx line, right? So I kind of framed it because I grew up in New England. If you don't like Xochitl's positions, just wait a few minutes and they'll change, just like New England weather. So now the social programs have to be permanent, and not only that, she actually kind of did this kind of medieval bloodletting where she cut her finger at a campaign appearance and promised in blood that she would not eliminate the social programs that were instituted in this government. Right? This is a testament to the level of distrust that the PAN has provoked in this country. That a PAN candidate has to swear in blood that they will not eliminate social programs if they're to get back into government, right?
There's an implicit confession that they're not to be believed, because
That they're not
actually
people
this is
being trusted.
it's a play out of the old playbook where Peña Nieto got all his team to sign before a public notary all of the campaign promises that they were going to keep, which of course they didn't, right? And so they have to go this extra step to try to convince people that they actually are going to commit on this. And you're right. Anybody who's paying attention knows that these positions change depending on the winds of the day. And I remember quite distinctly, one of the things that they tried to sell the public on when it came to selecting Xochitl Gálvez as the candidate for the opposition coalition was that she was progressive in social issues. That in
Could appeal
fact
to the
she was
timber.
not she was not like the rest of the PAN, which is socially conservative and has its roots in a very conservative culture in this country. And one of the ways that they would justify it saying is, well, she supports reproductive rights for women and has gone on the record every Women's Day to say so. I don't know what she said this last Women's Day, but I remember...
She backed away from that. She backed away from it. She refused to take a position.
Exactly. When they asked her, well, today is the day, and this was a couple months ago, is when they recognized the day to commemorate the struggle to achieve reproductive rights for women. What do you think? Do you still maintain the same position? She said, no, now I represent a diverse coalition, and so I can't make a comment on that. So, I mean, even when these issues, right, like those are rights. I mean, there's a reason I use the terminology reproductive rights. These are not things that are up for negotiation. This is not like the United States where the aim is to get a bunch of conservatives justices on the Supreme Court and roll back those rights. No, those rights have been long fought for and won, and I don't think that the feminist movement is willing to entertain notions of rolling back on that, except for the ones that, of course, have infiltrated the feminist movement and are trying to use that position to try to sell this candidacy to the Mexican public.
And as I put there in the last part of the tweet, they always say López Obrador is a populist, right? Which we've discussed in previous episodes. This catch-all term to denigrate anyone who's, remotely left of center. But then Xochitl Gálvez comes out the other day and says, I'm going to give out cards with money. Debit cards. Okay. Sound familiar? Right? The Mexican card with 5,000 pesos monthly to support women. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. That's a fine policy. It's supposedly going to be means tested, I think, in some cases. It's not going to be universal. That's the big thing on the right. These things have to be means tested, right? To create a big, onerous way of trying to calculate who should get something and who shouldn't. Right? The problem is she said the exact opposite in the past. She's been spending years saying López Obrador is a populist, and then comes out and says, all right, we're going to give out cards for women with 5,000 pesos a month. Not to mention the fact that those cards, when she holds up those cards, that smacks of how Peña Nieto bought the Mexican election in 2012, handing out those, preloaded debit cards, right? From Monex and the Soriana grocery stores. and such. So, as you say again, where Claudia Sheinbaum is talking about rights, these are universal rights, these are rights that everyone should have. These kind of stunts by Xochitl Gálvez, in light of her previous rhetoric, looks like that, right? Looks like a gimmick, and it looks like a way, considering what her coalition has done in the past, to try to purchase an election rather than establish a permanent right, right? She's also come out, of course, saying that the pensions are important now, but her party in the lower house, when it came time to vote for whether the pensions should be raised to a constitutional level, that is not just to be a law, but be included, enshrined in the Constitution as a constitutional right, her party voted against it, the PAN, right? Or they voted against it in the House, and then they decided to vote for it in the Senate. They were all over the place, just like her campaign is. They're all over the place, right?
Or like
And
their
this is
candidate in
exactly the
Mexico
answer of
City.
what's he trying to do to try to overcome 30 points, right?
Yeah. No, like their candidate in Mexico City, Santiago Taboada, very recently talks about, oh, let's celebrate the LGBT community. I'm an ally, et cetera, et cetera. But back when he was a legislator, he actually took a public position against equal marriage. So as you can see, this is not anything extraordinary. Campaigns are full of promises, full of people backtracking, all of that. But it is indicative, like you said, of a bit of a desperate campaign, it would seem. A campaign that is worried about being able to forget winning the election, but actually be able to pull enough votes, get enough supporters to have even a sizable presence in the state legislatures or in the federal Congress.
And it shows this kind of messaging in the campaign is absolutely in disarray, right? You've talked about how the PRI and the PAN in the coalition don't like each other, don't trust each other. We see Xochitl Gálvez this week actually openly complaining that the leaders of those parties, Alito Moreno and Marco Cortés, are hogging the campaign spots, right? And they're not letting her be in the spots, right? These two people who are already going to get into Congress by the proportional list system, they have their faces appearing in the in the campaign ads for the coalition instead of her. So you can tell the campaign is not having a good time. They're not coordinating their messaging, right? I might mention this later. Jorge Castaneda, the right winger who wants to launch a real old-fashioned U.S.-style dirty war negative campaign, is blaming the PRI, saying the PRI doesn't want this, right? So they're all blaming each other for everything, right? And then one more point on Xochitl Gálvez before we move on is that she's also said she wants to demilitarize the country, which is, a good goal. Who doesn't want that? But then wants to put the army out to fight the cartels, right? And triple the number of National Guard. So again, it's just, you can't really follow where she is from one day to the next. That creates confusion. And with this attempt to create a catch-all, what you're going to do is you're going to discourage your base. You're saying, why should I even bother with this person?
That's right.
Right?
Yeah,
So-
you're mobilizing some people in one part of the country and demobilizing people in a different part of the country. Because the truth is, let's talk about security. Let's talk about that, because that's actually one of the key issues that I think will probably be one of the defining things about this campaign. I think, objectively speaking, as a political analyst, it's probably where López Obrador is weakest. Even though we can look at the figures and we can talk about this being an inherited problem, at the end of the day, there are still many, many homicides happening in this country as a result of the ongoing issue with organized crime. And the opposition and their strategists also know that this is the issue. This is what's going to be able to at least reach the population in a sense to be like, this government may be doing more social programs and maybe lifting people out of poverty, but your community's still unsafe. So you would
Which is a
think
classic
they would have a
right-wing,
coherent
it's a
message.
classic right-wing attack. They would be crazy not to use that, right?
Exactly. But it's just a bit of an incoherent message. And it was really quite extraordinary. So it was one of the key things that Xochitl Gálvez's campaign talked about in that first week, right off the bat. And yet, the strategy wasn't really kind of obvious in terms of like, what are you going to do differently? What is it? Like, you can criticize López Obrador's slogan. They love to do that. Abrazos, no balazos, right? But what is your actual proposal? So she launches her campaign in one of the most dangerous states in the country, in sort of to try to highlight this, but doesn't really get into details. A few days later, has her advisor, when it comes to this issue, join her on stage. He doesn't even get to speak to the statement, and she does this weird little dance thing again, right? Instead of actually focusing on, this is what I'm going to do differently. And so it kind of, even from that kind of point of view, takes the wind out of the sails of her campaign. If this is your key issue and you can't actually communicate it well, what hopes do you have of actually being to convince the Mexican population otherwise of other issues where you think that they're not going far enough or they're not actually being effective enough?
Yeah, that's an important point, right? Because if you're going to make the case that you're going to be, tough on crime, whatever else, you have to be able to convey this image that, you're going to be a commander-in-chief that can do that can carry that out, right? And that the campaign hasn't managed to convey.
And so that brings us to the next point that we wanted to get into, and I'll go back to this screen here that we were looking at, which is the dirty campaign. And so there are now people openly calling, like you said, this article in particular, I think, kind of sums it up, right? Jorge Castañeda, he was the foreign minister under Vicente Fox from 2000 to 2003, still very much active in Mexican politics as a consultant, as an advisor. He apparently teaches at NYU. I haven't really heard anything about his teaching credentials, if he's a very good professor or not. But he goes on TV, he writes a blog post. He's kind of been everywhere with this thing. Whereas he's saying, this is not what I'm saying should be done. But I do think that given the circumstances, it is time to go seriously into a dirty war against Claudia Sheinbaum.
Now, what he means... I'm sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
No, I was going to say, even resorting to in English to kind of demonstrate where his mind's at, right?
Yeah, go negative in English.
Go negative, saying it quite literally in English. And he says, it seems logical to me. The manual right now is everything negative against Claudia and Andrés Manuel López Obrador, with an opposition investigation, with the gossip, with everything, which is even quite a bit of an admission there as well, right? With gossip, which is to say that when we talk about a dirty campaign, what do we mean? It means they're quite literally going to use things that are, in the best of cases, distortions of the truth, if not outright lies.
Yeah, and it's important to put this in a little bit of context, right? This idea of go negative was really first put into use in a serious way in Mexico in the 2006 campaign, AMLO's first presidential campaign, with this idea of creating the perception that AMLO was going to be a danger for Mexico, right? There was going to be devaluation and hyperinflation and blah, 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 and you're going to lose your house and all these spots. Who was behind that? Dick Morris, right? Americans of a certain age will remember Dick Morris from the Bill Clinton years, right? The idea of triangulating between the Democrats and Republicans. He got caught in this call girl scandal and sucking of toes and kind of, scuzz stuff, right? Morris. And Antonio Solá, the Spaniard, right? Who was really the architect of Peligro para Mexico. Just like NAFTA imported toxic food into Mexico and created an obesity and diabetes epidemic that did not exist before that, basically got a large part of the country addicted to sodas and processed foods and chips, which is just a tragedy in its own right. What Morris and Solá and their ilk did was to inject the worst of American-style and Spanish-style campaigning into Mexico, right? In 2006, it was very effective because the public was not used to it. It was new. It was fairly new. There's always been dirty pool in Mexico. I'm not saying there wasn't. But this style of American style of Oppo research, right, really just destroying, right? They mentioned the other night on that same program with Castaneda, the idea of swift boating of John Kerry, that kind of stuff was new here. And it worked. It worked to get the election close enough so that it could be stolen in 2006, which is what it needed to be done. Since then, the dirty war has been against AMLO has been never-ending, nonstop, right? To the point that it's gotten to the point now of the boy that cried wolf, right? They've attacked and they've tried to go after AMLO so much that the public's just like, oh, something else, something else, something else. The most recent is what we talked about on a previous program, was the whole thing about narco president, right? Spelled wrong in the hashtag.
That's right.
With ProPublica, with the New York Times, with the Baker Institute, and all the millions of dollars in hashtags about it. So what Castaneda is now arguing is that wasn't even enough. There has to be more. And it has to be directed against both of them, right? Both AMLO, who's been the lightning rod for this up till now, and Sheinbaum. One could very well imagine that if they haven't done the dirty war against Sheinbaum, it's not for lack of trying, that they haven't come up with stuff, right?
Yeah.
Or they're trying to hold it until later. Fine, right?
That's what I think. I think
Yeah.
what they're going to try to go after her more personally in the coming weeks and months. And I think they're holding their kind of most effective communication strategy for a little bit later in the campaign. They're hoping to see that they can slowly climb and then maybe deliver like a knockout punch. But I don't see it happening. And also, they're running against a candidate that's relatively hard to pin anything on them on her, right? She's got a very long political career, but beyond that, an academic career. So it's not like, there's shady businesses going on or, unreported
Right.
properties or anything of the sort, right? Like they have a very, very tall order up before them if they think that the strategy is going after Claudia Sheinbaum personally.
And I think that's why they've been going after AMLO obsessively, to the point that it's like doesn't seem even clear to them that he's not on the ballot this time. He's not running again. Do people really understand this point? He's not running again, right? But AMLO, gets in the arena and slugs it out. So, attracts these kinds of attacks. And it's interesting that, right, Castaneda is making the case, right, of course he's trying to distance himself from it, that's where now Xochitl Gálvez has to go, right? And you can see it in the PAN's, lightly, in the PAN's commercials, right? Morena basically has their commercials, we're going to do this and this. The PRI, we're going to do this and this. The PAN, all their commercials are like, we're citizens and we're attacking Morena.
Yeah.
They can do what they want, right? But again, they've backed themselves into the corner in the sense of they've attacked AMLO nonstop now for 18 years. So one has to ask the question: how effective will that kind of, U.S. style, go negative be? Right?
Yeah.
Go negative happens in the United States because it's a different political climate. It's a political climate where political campaigns are private. There's no public financing. All media is private. And, because of Citizens United, there's no limit to what, shady interests can pour into campaigns and PACs and super PACs.
That's right. I think
That
the key thing too
is what they really want to replicate in Mexico. That's what they want to replicate.
Yeah, to kind of, the tribalism of politics that happens in the United States. But I think a key thing, like I remember watching the 2018 and there was this iconic moment where they tried to say that López Obrador is Putin's candidate in Mexico. And he made this tongue-in-cheek video going to the coast saying, here's the boat from Russia. It's here to just, unload. I'm Lolovich or whatever, right? Like a very kind of tongue-in-cheek making fun of it. Yeah. And you're right, because they had been the same line over and over again, that approach, that response to that attack worked really well. Everybody treated it as a joke, and it had basically no echo. So if it didn't work in 2018, what makes them think it's going to work in 2024? And then complicated by the fact that López Obrador has been in power. Now people understand, did the peso go up to 30 to the US dollar as they said it would? No, it didn't. Did foreign direct
It's down to
investment fall?
1680,
No, it
by the
didn't.
way.
Yeah, right? Like all of the things that they said, all of the nightmare scenarios that they tried to convince the public would happen if Morena and López Obrador won didn't happen. And so
Yeah.
this same kind of fear mongering is less effective, even more so in this election cycle than it was 6 years ago, because people can now attest to the fact that all of those negative things didn't happen. And in fact, a lot of positive things did. And I want to close my intervention on this topic with basically that, which is that one point that I always like to insist on is that people need to understand that the consciousness of the population has shifted. And it's something that we saw at Friday's event. I know everybody who I talked to all said, had it really clear. This is about two visions for the country. One vision that says, continue with the transformation, continue with an expansion of access to rights, continue with public investment, a larger role for the state, continue with basically the political program that Morena, and then obviously with Claudia's campaign saying, I will do this and more, I will build on the successes, but not only that, we'll do this. In addition, the second floor of the transformation, as she calls, right? It's not just a question of, what is the appetite of the electorate today? Again, that kind of U.S.-centric vision of how elections are run, that, well, no, the population wants a change, right? Or I did many years of political work in Canada, right? And they always say that in Canada, governments don't get voted in, they get voted out, right? It's this kind of logic that doesn't work in a context like the one that we are in Mexico in this election cycle, which is a population that says, we voted for López Obrador, he largely did what he said he was going to do, and we want to continue supporting this because the material improvements in my life are very evident. And that is the scenario that the opposition is facing that I don't think they're quite grasping, and therefore are doing things like this, like calling for a dirty campaign or using all kinds of flip-flopping on positions to try to convince, delivering one message to one part of the country, delivering a different message to another.
Yeah, there's a few points there. That's really well said. I think it's important to really make clear that Mexico is not Canada and Mexico is not the United States, right? So this idea of just importing strategies, right, is problematic, right? Like you said, in Canada, the idea that governments aren't voted in, they're voted out. Or this idea that every candidate has to be new, like a brand new product, like a brand new detergent, like a brand new box of cereal, right? New and improved, right? American style, original. Whereas Claudia Sheinbaum was openly saying, I'm part of a social movement. This is a party. We had a long process to come at our platform. It's not just my individual platform. We're having a whole series of conferences and dialogues to get at, solutions to problems, right? So, yes, I am the continuity candidate. I don't have to be the new box of detergent. I don't have to be the new box of cereal, right? I have my own accent on things, as we talked about in the last program, but I'm part of a movement. And if the movement is doing well, we want more of that movement. We want more of what this is, right? And I think Mexicans understand very clearly that the hole the country was in requires a lot more than 6 years to get at, It requires, this is a generational change, right? 6 years is very little in that respect, right? So I think that's one thing. And I think the second thing before, if we don't want to overextend because we've got more topics, the dirty war is not seen the same in Mexico as the United States. It's seen to be worse. It's seen to be uglier. It's seen to be meaner. Mexicans are very clear as to who are the figures in the media, who are the figures behind the media. 2006, it might have worked enough, although AMLO still really won. But the dirty war, what we call that kind of go negative, is just not as culturally accepted in Mexico as it is in the U.S. It just isn't. So that's also another problem when you're trying to import something from another country. And lastly, it's the disarray of the campaign. Just to close this out, right? I'm for this. I'm for the opposite. I'm now Xochitl Gálvez wants a national care system, which is what Claudia Sheinbaum has said. She wants a scholarship system, which is what Claudia Sheinbaum has said, right? She wants, support for women, which is what Claudia Sheinbaum has said. But at the same time, how can you be copying a campaign that you're then going to go negative on? It's contradictory. I want to keep the social programs. So there's a lot of good things in this government that they're admitting by their very act of trying to copy so many of them. But then I'm going to go negative on them? I mean, not negative in the sense of criticizing and critiquing, but go negative in the real nasty American sense of going negative. That's what Castanet is talking about here. It just doesn't line up, right?
And then you made an interesting point when you talk about some of the cultural elements of this campaign. And I have to say, one of the strategies that it seems that they've employed is also bringing in foreign voices. And we saw very recently this voice from Spain, from the Partido Popular, from Spain, who came to participate in the Festival of Ideas, which is, these ruling class TED Talk type events where they talk grandiose solutions to all the world's problems. A bit of kind of like, the Davos model of like, no, we have all the solutions. We just don't have the ingenuity or, the right people aren't in place. Anyway, so of course, one of the forces behind that is a man we talked about previously on this program, Ricardo Salinas Pliego, who, as we know, is at odds with this government because this government wants to make his company pay back taxes and he refuses to. So we had this, quite literally, a descendant of, royal blood from Spain, a very controversial figure from there, of course, not very well known here in Mexico, come and participate at this Festival of Ideas. And what does she do? Well, the Mexican Constitution actually prohibits foreigners from getting involved in direct politics. Now, it's not a provision that is applied very frequently, but this kind of scenario that we just saw play out is exactly what it's actually meant to stop from happening. So you have this foreign political actor representing a foreign political party coming into Mexico during an election period and calling for the public to vote for one candidate over another. And I think this image here that I found online really kind of captures it. Remind me of her name because she's got one of those really long royal names. Calling for the young people to vote for Xochitl Gálvez, but of course, which he's actually representing, is that old colonial conquistador attitude. We see this woman, this cartoon of her wearing conquistador outfit while resting on the head of Xochitl Gálvez, right?
Yeah,
kind of
Cayetana Álvarez de Toledo.
Yeah,
is her name.
I mean, and imagine that's the logic of this campaign. Let's bring this, aristocrat from the old world to Spain to set these young people straight. How dare they think that they should vote for Morena, for those populists, that democracy is at stake. There's that language again that we've analyzed on this program, right? But I think it speaks to just how out of touch they are. Did they really think? I mean, they got really excited by this. I saw so much chatter on social media about, like, look at this young, blonde woman coming and sharing her expertise. She's a real champion of democracy in her country, telling that this is what's at stake in this election and that we should all vote for Xochitl Gálvez, right? But did they really think that this was going to convince people that this is one of the tools that they should employ as part of this exercise?
Yeah, especially coming on the heels of Xochitl Gálvez's disastrous trip to New York and Washington, which we covered on this program, right? The cringe colonial tour. And then she was off to Spain, right, which was even worse because nobody even wanted to meet her there, right, meeting with Atlas Network surrogates and such. And then they decided this is going to be a brilliant idea to bring in a surrogate from the Partido Popular in Spain, right? When the right wing in Mexico should realize that they already have a problem in this area. We've talked about in the opposition rallies are all very white and older. That's just a fact. So you think that what they would want to do is, make more headway, get more representation in the vast majority of the Mexican population. But what they're doing is they're doubling down on whiteness. right? On whiteness, blondness, and bringing in a representative from the Spanish monarchy. Effectively, I mean, a royal descendant, right? Who got booed at her speech, and then Salinas Pliego had to stand up and try to, arrange the whole situation. And then also at a time, and I think this is even a larger perspective on it, Jose Luis, at a time when the American elite, and by extension the Western European elite, is in a credibility crisis that we haven't seen since Vietnam over the genocide in Gaza.
Yeah.
I think it's much worse than Vietnam even. When have we seen in our lifetimes, maybe Iraq 2003, but this is worse, the global north and Western elite at a greater crisis of legitimacy worldwide? And this is the time that the PAN and the PRI decide to hang on to them for dear lives. You would think that for mere political survival, Mexican's conservative coalition would try to play some distance with the United States right now, seeing with what's going on in Gaza, right? No, they're going full throttle on hugging the empire, right? I just find that to be amazing to me. It's like they can't not do it, right?
Yeah.
They don't know how to not do it, right?
I mean, isn't this why they picked Xochitl as the candidate, to try to appeal to that indigenous mestizo part of
Right,
the population,
in theory.
to speak to us, the darker skinned peoples of this country? But I guess they've walked away from that, or just incapable of trying to be coherent on that. So anyway, that brings me to the next point that I wanted to look at in this episode, which is when you're faced with this scenario, what do? Well, you have to try to craft a narrative, in fact, projecting into the future. I think in a lot of ways, the opposition knows they don't really stand a chance in this election. I think if they were holding on to hope that things could turn around, they've seen that the poll numbers have not moved, right? They've all been within the margin of error. It's impossible to say that, oh no, one is on an upward or downward trajectory, right? Things are largely the same. And so the thinking about 2023, I think, has led them to the following, which I want to share with you. I thought this was a really interesting tweet. Jose Diaz Briceño, he's the correspondent for Reforma in the US, and he says the following: while still not supported in surveys, there's now a growing sense among political pundits of all stripes that AMLO's coalition could lose the Mexico City mayoral election. Again, I think it's more accurate to call it governor, but let's take it for what it is. Says, while not supported in surveys. So why would Jose decide to qualify his statement? Well, because it's really evident. These are the polling numbers for Mexico City. So there is a concurrent race for Jefatura de Gobierno, as I mentioned at the beginning. And here you see the numbers for Clara Brugada, who is the candidate of the Morena coalition with PT and Verde, against Santiago Taboada from the opposition PRI-PAN PRD coalition, and also, like I mentioned, the third way, the third candidate, Salmon Chertorivsky. So we have 57 to 37 to 5%. So in this poll, the gap is at least 20, and this is actually a poll of polls. So what this does is bring together the various different polls over time, right? So currently they stand at a 20-point gap. How is it possible that there are people speculating like this, that the Morena coalition could lose Mexico City? I think it's because, one, we talked about this last time. If voter turnout is low, that favors Morena, because Morena is better organized, it has more supporters, it's better able to pull the vote. If the base of the opposition parties do not feel inspired, if they don't feel mobilized, they won't go out to vote, right? That's a key thing. That's why it's very difficult to precisely predict what the actual result is. Polls can give you an idea, but a lot of things can happen the actual day of. How many people are actually going to go and vote? I think with all the negative campaign, I think Morena supporters are going to be motivated in a way that they maybe wouldn't have been otherwise. They would have been like, well, the election's in the bag, they don't really need my vote. I don't think that is the case. But the other ones, they have to convince them that it's worth going out to vote, because if they don't, then all the down ballot races will also be affected. So Mexico City, and I think this is important to remember, in 2021, the midterm elections, many of the boroughs, the 16 boroughs that make up Mexico City, ended up going to the opposition, half of them. So basically the wealthier southern part of the city and the west of the city. And if some surprises there, Azcapotzalco, which is generally viewed as a place where Morena wins, actually went to the opposition. And so I think people are
Which
misreading.
was governed terribly in those boroughs, actually.
Oh, I
It's
mean,
kind of
if you look at the
comically bad, actually, which has really helped Morena this
Yeah.
time around. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, most of those they're widely expected to win back, but there's a handful of them, right? Miguel Hidalgo, Álvaro Obregón. They have a shot maybe in Cuauhtémoc, although the opposition did a really, really bad job there. There's only a handful of Benito Juárez, which has always been controlled by the PAN since there have been democratic elections in Mexico City. But people are misreading 2021. You have to remember, 2021, we were still in the midst of a pandemic. Voter turnout was low. And it was a bad moment for Morena in the eyes of sort of that progressive, professional, middle class segment of society, which does vote quite enthusiastically, very actively in Mexico City, who decided to punish Morena because of a series of scandals involving some of their candidates, representing some questionable incidents in their past, which I think served to really demobilize Morena. And that, again, that kind of progressive, socially progressive base that they do have here in the capital, which is not the case this time around, right? This idea that the pattern that we saw emerge in 2021 is going to repeat this year, I think is a misreading of the situation, but also, as I say, doesn't really correspond with reality on the ground. And so what do I think they're trying to do? I think they know that historically, these progressive governments, be it Ecuador, Venezuela, one of the places where they can be shown to be losing support or be shown to be weak is by losing the capital, right? It happened to Rafael Correa in the capital of Quito, and it actually happened to Maduro in Venezuela, where they lost control of Caracas. And
Buenos Aires and Argentina did that too.
And Argentina as well, which, although that's a bit of a different case because it tends to vote right-wing, Buenos Aires, it's a bit different in that sense, but was at one point governed by the progressive forces there. And so, they understand that, one, you can make it seem like this impenetrable fortress, in fact, can be defeated by trying to win in a place like the capital, but also recognizing that that is arguably the second most important political post in this country, right? So there's obviously the president being the most important political post, followed by the governor of Mexico City, and is often viewed as a stepping stone to being a viable candidate in the presidential race. And so I think they're thinking, if we can stress that we can win in the capital, then possibly if we do pull it off, that can be our candidate in 2030 because 2024 looks to be done. But it's a narrative. It doesn't actually reflect what's happening inside of the country here. And I think that's quite dangerous because as this tweet says it, there's a growing sense among political pundits of all stripes that could lose. So they're introducing this idea, despite the fact that, as it stands, according to polls, there's a 20-point lead.
Yeah, and this is important. Reforma is a right-wing paper, right? Which publishes all kinds of unfounded, bilge, a lot of that coming from the U.S. So if there would be any paper that would try to introduce a narrative, it's Reforma, right? And the tweet itself is really fascinating. While not supported in surveys, right, there's no data here. I've got no data behind this. There's a growing sense amongst pundits, right? Mexico's pundit class, which is famous for getting everything spectacularly wrong, right? Spectacularly wrong, especially the established ones on, Televisa and TV Azteca and, the columnists, right, that everybody, identifies. Spectacularly wrong. These pundits now have a growing sense, not reflected in the polls, so they're ahead of the public. They're ahead of the public on this. They're a vanguard, that the coalition could lose the election. Right? This is exactly like the situation we talked about in a previous episode with this idea of AMLO narco, right? There's no evidence, right? Not supported here it's not supported in the surveys, there it's not supported in the evidence. So we're going to try to create a perception. We're going to try to create a perception, right? Through this idea that they could be in cahoots in this election, and in a previous election, and in a previous election. And then by an accumulation of articles, try to create a perception of where there's smoke, there's fire. Same thing here, right? You've got different pundits saying the same thing to try to create a perception, right? Where even we see this on the screen, the polls have been remarkably stable since at least the middle of last year. Since at least the middle of last year,
Yeah.
right?
At no
Now-
point do we even come close.
Yeah.
And I mentioned I live in Mexico City, and the city is just totally covered in propaganda at this point. But I would say that maybe for every one poster or banner for Clara Brugada, the candidate of Morena, there's 10 for Santiago Taboada, right? So there is a very concerted effort at spending money, spending energy, getting it out there, and trying to put his name. He's actually been circulating his name illegally, not respecting electoral laws for months now, trying to put that into people's minds that he is the candidate, right? And similarly to the national level, is running his campaign basically saying, I presided over one of the boroughs in a really, really effective manner, and I made it safe and all this kind of stuff, right? But again, it's a lack of understanding of what the situation actually looks like on the ground, right? Mexico City is a working class city. It has wealthy pockets, but it's a working class city. And the people who live and work here understand the difference that López Obrador's government has represented. They have seen the investments that Claudia Sheinbaum made. Now, she had a rough go, right? There was, a couple of pretty major incidents when she was jefa de gobierno, right? And the first one that comes to mind being the collapse of that piece of the metro, which left many people dead.
The Line 12.
Nonetheless, even with those kinds of blemishes on her record, and arguably not really her responsibility, that project was not built by her.
But that did happen
Compared
right
to-
before those midterm elections, too.
Yeah, exactly, which is another thing that I think really affected that result. But, you see these communities that have new busways and new cable and new gondolas and new parks and the cash transfer programs. Anybody who has a student in the public school system receives a universal subsidy to pay for school supplies and things like that. That's something that she delivered that actually changed. Before, they used to only give it to the best and the brightest students, right? These are the things, like if you spend time in Gustavo Amadero, Azcapotzalco, in Iztacalco, right? Iztapalapa, the working class parts of this city, you'll understand that if people are going to come out to vote, they're going to vote probably for the candidate that represents the coalition that has made that material improvement in people's lives. And these pundits who live and work in the wealthy pockets, right, in the Roma and the Condesa and Polanco, who only associate with them, seem to be allowing themselves to be convinced that this candidate actually has a shot. Does he have a better shot than Xochitl Gálvez does at the presidency? Sure, admittedly, right? Will they probably win some of the boroughs? Yeah, they probably will. Chances are, there's 16 boroughs. They'll probably win. In the best of circumstances, the opposition will win 6 of them, maybe more. But chances are it's going to be between 4 and 6, right? The wealthier ones. But even then, even in places like Álvaro Obregón, right? Morena is spending a lot of energy. I went to one of the rallies that the organizers, the grassroots leaders of Morena in Álvaro Obregón held right after that demo in the Capitol on the following Saturday. And it was amazing to hear the level of organization, the commitment that people have, the kind of efforts, the actual work of turning out supporters. I think it's a pretty well-oiled machine, and that's a pretty formidable thing to go up against when you're representing, as I've mentioned before, a heterogeneous coalition full of rank-and-file membership that actually doesn't like each other, right? Santiago Taboada comes from the National Action Party, the PAN. Is the PRI in Mexico City going to, go out there to go and try to pull the vote for him? I find that unlikely.
Yeah, and very quickly on this, too. Horse race politics generates clicks, right? In a race that's being decided by 30 points at the national level and 20 points at the city level, subject to change, seems very stable, right? Doesn't tend to generate enough clicks for media, right? Creating a perception of horse race generates clicks. Clicks generates ad revenue and the like. So you're always going to see an attempt to generate an idea of a horse race, right? And it's interesting that going back to what we were talking about before about Castaneda and this idea of chisme and gossip, a lot of this is being based on chismes, right? Gossips. That there's tension in the Brugada camp, that there's tension between Brugada and Claudia Scheinbaum, and a long list of etc. They may very well be. There's tensions always in politics. People who were chosen, people who weren't chosen, people who were in, people who were out. But all of this idea of we know what's going on because we have the insider game, that's this idea of correspondence from always, because we have access to the chisme, we have access to the gossip, right? Whereas what you're reporting on is what's actually going on the ground game, which is actually going to be much more decisive at the end of the day than, the gossip game.
That's absolutely right. Well, before we close today's program, we're going to go back to what is now a tried and true segment of our show here, So What Any Other Mexican Politics Podcast, which is the terrible news coverage of Mexico. And we got another really good example of it here. And I'll hand it over to you, Kurt. You can walk us through this latest piece. I'll just put it up on the screen real quick. From Mark Stevenson, went out through the AP Wire. Mexico's most dangerous city for police refuses to give up or negotiate with cartels. Ooh, spooky. So what's this article all about? Why should we be worried about the way it's presenting the news to us?
I think we need a real sparkling visual here. Dumb article of the week. When we have a little bit more of a budget, we can look into that, right? As I put in my tweet here, just when you thought it couldn't get any worse, right? Taking into consideration all the other articles we've talked about on this still young podcast, U.S. coverage of Mexico has descended to third grade level, right? With Mark Stevenson's piece in the AP, right? It starts off by talking about what's going on in Celaya, right? Which is a city in Guanajuato, and which has, admittedly, significant problems with violence, right? But what is Mark Stevenson's take on it, right from the beginning, right? Right almost at the beginning of the piece. Mexico's president dislikes police and would like to rely on the military for everything. This is an extraordinary statement. Besides the fact that it's written at third grade level, right? It's also written with a kind of a third grade psychology, right? AMLO dislikes police. What does that even mean?
It makes me laugh. I don't understand it.
What does that mean? What is this? Yep. And he wants the military to do everything. And then it says, he dissolved the old federal police, accusing them of corruption, and cut almost all federal funding for training and equipping of local police. Now, that is a lie. That is a lie, right? The federal government still contributes 200 billion pesos a year to states and municipalities for security matters, right? We'll just, glide right over that, right? But let's just go down to the next one, right? It's as if the dissolving of the federal police happened in a historical vacuum, right? The PFP, the Federal Preventative Police, until 2009, and then after that, the Federal Police until 2019. No mention at all of how the former security minister and head of the Federal Police, Genaro Garcia Luna, and his connections with the Sinaloa cartel, not mentioned. That's funny that that's not mentioned in any of the pieces we've talked about. None of them. None of them. Not mentioned in ProPublica, not mentioned in New York Times, not mentioned anywhere. Right? They want to erase Genaro Garcia Luna from the map in the U.S. media. And I find that to be fascinating in order to kind of create their own counter-historical narrative on this. Right? When he was convicted very recently in a court in New York City, in English. So they can't even make the excuse that, oh, well, it's in Spanish or whatever else. It happened in New York City. Right? No mention of that. No mention of right? Rey Zambada's testimony at that very trial that said police were being used to whisk drugs out of the Mexico City airport, amongst other things, totally complicit, right? No discussion of the differences between the funding mechanisms for how the federal government funds, right, state and local. Why go into such details of how the federal government funds state and local police forces, right? None of that, right? All you get instead, right, some kind of nuanced analysis of a very complex situation is, and wait for it, AMLO dislikes police. I mean, that's just forehead slapping dumb. Forehead slapping dumb. Besides the level of, of the writing of it. It's an incredible act of memory holding, all in the service of, I mentioned three things, and I think there's probably more. First, making a cheap and deeply misleading commercial for Xochitl Galvez, the conservative candidate, right? Because the perception Stevenson wants to make is, AMLO got rid of the police, Xochitl will bring them back, right? Commercial for Xochitl Galvez. All right. Number two, making the case for a more violent response to the cartels. Because if you look at the piece, the whole piece is Zelaya is standing up to the cartels. They refuse to give up. They refuse to negotiate. AMLO is soft, and they're going hard after them. And the police are suffering for it. I'm sure the police are suffering in Zelaya. I'm not doubting that at all. Right? The problem is the framing of the piece. Right? It's just a reiteration of the U.S. failed drug war rhetoric. Right? Got to go hard against them. Go hard. Go against everything. Don't be soft. It's such a murderous oversimplification of the situation. And then number three.
And I think it's also.
Yeah, please.
I was just going to say, one of the parts that kind of frustrates me about this is also that, again, U.S.-centric vision, this idea that cartels are these well-structured, very vertical organizations that if you just have a strong federal police force and take out the leadership, which is basically the logic of the, U.S.-led drug war,
Kingpin
then
strategy.
you'll solve the problem. But it's a total misunderstanding of how organized crime in this country actually works, right? There's this excellent book called "The Cartels Don't Exist," and it's true, right? There are organized crime groups, and there are people at the top. But the way that drug trafficking, organized crime groups actually work in this country is by controlling plazas, by controlling territories. And the way you control territories is by co-opting first the municipal police and the municipal politicians, and then forces inside of the state level, right?
Yeah.
And then as we saw with Felipe Calderon's, it actually reached all the way into the federal level to the top echelons of the federal police force. So this idea that if you just have more police at the municipal and state levels to handle this issue is actually a total misreading of the way that these groups actually have influence and power over parts of this country. And it's very frustrating to see this very, like you said, third grade logic to say, well, if we just have more police, if we just didn't have this president that dislikes them, then, this would be a safer country.
Who wants to hug people, hug criminals.
If they actually followed this recipe, the security situation in this country would only get worse.
And more violent, more deaths, more blood. And no changing the drug situation. Has happened. We saw it happen. How many more Mexicans have to die for, the Mark Stevensons of the U.S. press to wake up to the situation? Right? But they just keep pushing the same thing.
Which is what you say here in your end point. I didn't mean to interrupt you there. Their third point, right, which is to misinform the public, right? Like, that is part of the aim. They need to sustain this narrative, right, that everything is bad the way that things are under the current leadership, therefore it must change, and that means voting for the opposition.
And there it is. It's a piece that very conveniently dovetails both trying to support Mexico's opposition and supporting rhetoric that benefits agencies like the DEA, which want to continue, the strategy of, the drug war and their operations here and the kingpin strategy, right? And having their tentacles all over the country. Right? Isn't it amazing how these pieces always seem to be favoring the same actors on both sides? Just what a coincidence, right?
Strange. Well, I think on that note, we'll wrap up today's program. And as always, we want to invite people to follow the Mexico Solidarity Project. Sign up for the Bulletin, the Mexico Solidarity Project Bulletin, a bilingual weekly, comes out every Wednesday, bringing you news and information about Mexico from a different perspective, and also sharing some of these insights that you won't hear from other English language media. But of course, there's also Mexico Solidarity Media, mexicosolidarity.com. And of course, as always, this has been a pleasure, Kurt, being here with you, the Mexican Politics Podcast, which I think we're ready to announce to the public will be switching to a weekly format. So
Weekly.
hopefully we can get
Ba-ba-da-dum.
and
So we'll see you
next
sooner rather than later, right? Next week.
yeah, and get in touch with us. What are the issues that you are curious about? Send us a message on social media. There's lots of ways to get in touch. Kurt, what's the best way for people to follow you on social media?
Yeah, I'm on Twitter at Kurt Hackbarth. I've also got my Facebook page, right? And you can find me at Jacobin Magazine and at Sentido Común in Mexico.
Excellent. So get in touch with us. I'm on social media. My handle is Granado Ceja, GRANADOSCEJA, on all social media channels. Let us know what you want to hear about, what you want us to cover. We're here to provide that information to you, and we will see you next week on Soberanía, the Mexican Politics Podcast.